Good day, everyone. I'm here again with the next episode, and this episode we'll be talking about head to head movement. Of course, before we discuss this, let's have these learning objectives, understand the distinction between D structure and S structure, determine whether a language is verb racing or not. Explain the evidence for VT movement in French and Irish. Discuss the position of tense English auxiliaries as compared to main verbs. Explain how the VP internal subject hypothesis accounts for VSO languages. And discuss the whens, wheres, and whys of do support. Consider the relation between a verb and its object. According to X-bar theory, an object is a complement to V, sister to V, daughter of V. This means that no specifier or adjunct can intervene between the complement and the head. If it did, the object would no longer be a complement. The following sentence is from Modern Irish, which is a subject verb object, word, or the language. Kissed Mary the leprechaun. In this sentence, the subject, a specifier, intervenes between the verb and the object. This sentence cannot be generated by X-bar theory. Try to draw a tree where the specifier intervenes between the head and the complement. It's impossible. Now, consider the following sentence from French. I eat often of the apples. I often eat apples. Souvent often intervenes between the verb and the object. If souvent is an adjunct, it is appearing between a head and its complement. X-bar theory can draw the tree for this one either. Finally, think about the relationship between the auxiliary verb have and its complement main verb in number 3. In the last chapter, we claimed that the participle is a complement to the auxiliary, yet here it is appearing separated from that complement by the negative word not. He has not eaten yet today. This is surprising. X-bar theory requires that complements be adjacent to the head that introduce them, but here we see 3 cases where that isn't true. In sum, X-bar theory undergenerates because it does not produce all the possible grammatical sentences in a language. Although his concerns were based on very different problems than the ones in 1 to 3, Chomsky, 1957, observed that a phrase structure grammar, such as X-bar theory, cannot generate all the sentences of a language. He proposed that what's needed was a set of rules that change structure generated by phrase structure rules. Now, these rules are called transformational rules. Transformations take the output of X-bar rules and other transformations and change them into different trees. The model of grammar that we are suggesting here takes the form in number 4. You should read this like a flow chart. The derivation of a sentence starts at the top, and what comes out at the bottom is your judgment about the acceptability of that sentence. Now, take a look on this flow chart. The computational component, so the X-bar rules, the lexicon, the base, this structure constrained by the theta criterion, transformation rules, as structure constrained by EPP and grammaticality judgments. X-bar theory and the lexicon conspire together to generate trees. The conspiracy is called the base. The result of this tree generation is a level we call this structure. These used to be called deep structure, but for the reasons that need not concern us here, the name has changed to D structure. You'll never pronounce or hear a D structure. This structure is also sometimes called the underlying form or underlying representation and is similar in many ways to the underlying form found in phonology. The theta criterion filters out in grammatical sentences at this structure. This structure is a subject to the transformational rules. These transformational rules can move words around in the sentence. We've actually already seen one of these transformational rules. In Chapter 7, we look briefly at T to C movement in subject-aux inversion constructions. In this chapter, we're going to look in more detail at this rule. The output of transformational rule is called the S structure of a sentence. The S structure is filtered by the EPP, which ensures that the sentence has a subject. What are left are grammatical sentences. In the version of Chomskyan grammar we are considering here, we'll look at 2 different kinds of transformations, movement rules and insertion rule. Movement rules move things around in a sentence. Insertion rules put something new into the sentence. This chapter is about one kind of movement rule. The rules that move one head into another called head-to-head movement. This transformation of rules will allow us to generate sentences like 1 to 3 above. X bar theory by itself cannot produce these structures. Let's return now to the problems we raised in the introduction to this chapter. Let's start with the sentence from French. I eat often of the apples. I often eat apples. In this sentence, an adjunct surprisingly appears between the head of VP and its complement. Compare the sentence to the English sentence in number 6. I often eat apples. In the English sentence, the adjunct does not intervene between the verb and the complement. The tree for number 6 would look like number 7. Notice the following thing about this structure. There is a head position that intervenes between the subject DP and the adverb often. This is the T position. T, you will recall, selects for the inflection of the verb or surfaces as an auxiliary. Notice that in French, in number 5, the thing that appears between the subject and the verb is not T but the tense main verb. Keeping this idea in the back of your mind, now consider the following chart, which shows the relative placement of the major constituents of a French sentence with a tense main verb, an English sentence with a tense verb, both language with auxiliary constructions, and a model in the English. Now, there are several things to observe about this chart. Recall from chapter 2 that models are instances of the category T. This being so, V. Adjuncts are predicted to invariably follow them. This seems to be the case. E. What is striking about the above chart is that tense auxiliaries in both languages and tense main verbs in French also seem to occupy this slot, whereas in English, main verbs follow the adverb. Let's start with the differences in the placement of the main verb in the two languages. In French, the position of the main verb alternates in position relative to the adverb. In 8b, the adverb follows the main verb, and in 8d, it precedes it. How can we account for this alternation? Assume that the form has a structure that meets X-bar theory and the same basic tree is generated for both English and French. The difference between the two is the French has a special extra rule that moves verbs out of the VP around the adverb and into the slot associated with T. This is the transformational rule we'll call V to T. It is also known as verb movement or verb raising. This rule is informally stated in 9. V to T movement, move the head V to the head T. Before looking at an example, consider for a moment why this rule might apply. There is a logic to why this rule would apply. The verb bearing the tense inflection in 8b ends up in the T tense node. By contrast, in 8d, the main verb doesn't bear tense inflection, so it doesn't raise into the T node. Let's do a derivation for the French sentence Je mange souvent des pommes. The first step in the derivation is to build an X-bar structure and insert all the words. This gives us the 3D structure of the sentence. Notice that this D structure is not a grammatical sentence of French, yet in fact it has exactly the same word order as the English sentence in number 6. The next step in the derivation is to apply the transformation of verb movement. One typical way of representing a movement transformation is to draw an arrow starting in the D structure position of the move element and ending in the S structure position. This results in the correct S structure string. The T in 12 stands for trace and sits at the T structure position of the verb. By doing this movement transformation, we end up with the order that was not predicted by X-bar theory, and at the same time can maintain the strong hypothesis that X-bar theory is an important part of how sentences are put together. What is critical for this strong claim to be true is the fact that alternates in position between 8b and 8d. The participate form in 8d is in exactly the same position as all main verbs in English. The fact that the verb appears in the pre-adverb T node position precisely and only when it is tense that has air of an explanation. What we have seen so far is a rather technical solution to a relatively small problem. Now I'm going to show you that this solution can be extended. Recall our chart with adverb above in number 8. Consider now the same chart but with negatives. Before leaving the topic of the movement of heads, we briefly return to a phenomenon somewhat obliquely discussed in chapter 7. This is the phenomenon known as T to Z's movement or subject aux inversion. In yes or no questions in English, questions that can be answered with either a yes or no, auxiliary verbs invert with their subject. You have squeezed the toilet paper. Have you squeezed the toilet paper? In chapter 7, we claim that this alternation is due to the presence of a special null question complementizer. We observe that in many languages such as Polish and Irish, yes or no questions aren't indicated with subject aux inversion, but with a special form of the initial complementizer. Recall Irish is VSO to start with, so subject aux inversion would do nothing. Did you see the dog? We claim that the subject aux inversion is a special case of these question complementizers. English doesn't have an overt pronounced question complementizer like that Irish. Ein. Instead, English has a null complementizer, being phonologically null. However, it is a bit of problem since the difference in meaning between a statement and a question is encoded in something that you can't hear. English employs a mechanism which we know how is a transformation that gives phonological content to that by moving t to it around the subject. In the previous section, we claimed that Irish VSO order involves raising the verb to T. We are also forced to claim that subjects were generated VP internally. Notice that in English, we also have a VS order found in yes or no questions. These VS orders we analyze as T to C movement, with that subject remaining in its more typical place in the specifier of TP. Why don't we analyze Irish VSO order the same way? Instead of having VP internal subjects, why don't we simply have verbs raised to T then to T to C in all Irish clauses? These two would derive VSO order. There is a very good reason for this. Recall that in English T to C movement is black when there is an overt complementizer. You don't move T into the C because it already has phonologic content. If Irish VSO really involves raising to C, then it should be the case that you do not get VSO order when there is an overt complementizer. This is false. You get VSO order even when there is a complementizer. Said I that kiss Mary the leprechaun. I said that Mary kissed the leprechaun. This means that VSO must result from movement of the verb to some position lower than the complementizer. This is the analysis we argued for above, where V raises to T and the subject is in the specifier of VP. This kind of analysis is supported by the fact subject aux inversion T to C in a strict complementary distribution with overt question complementizers as seen in the following embedded clauses. I ask have you squeezed the toilet paper. I ask whether you have squeezed the toilet paper. I ask whether have you squeezed the toilet paper. So the process of subject aux invention must be properly triggered by complementizers. This rule is very similar to the rule of V to T movement. It is triggered by morphological requirements such as the fact that something contentful must be pronounced or that an affix needs a host. For many people, this sentence is not grammatical unless the embedded clause is a direct code. That is, it would properly be written with around it. This fact muddies the water somewhat in this argument, as it may not be the case that T to C movement is allowed at all in embedded clauses in English. However, the same facts do hold true in other languages, where subject aux inversion in embedded clauses is more clearly instantiated. In English, an interesting effect emerges when we try to question a sentence with no auxiliary. You eat apples. Do you eat apples? In sentences with no auxiliary, we insert a dummy or meaningless auxiliary in yes or no questions. There must be a reason for this. We have argued that in English, main verbs do not raise to T. At the same time in questions, the transformation of T to C movement forces the same T to raise. This is a contradiction. T has to raise to C, but there is nothing in it, because unlike sentences with auxiliaries, nothing has raised to this position. The phenomenon of do support appears to be an escape hatch for T. If we insert a dummy contentless auxiliary to fill T, then this dummy can undergo T to C movement, so this is do support. Do support when there is no other option for supporting inflectional affixes. Insert the dummy verb do into T. This rule applies only in the case that there is nothing else you can do. They are, in essence, operations of last resort. You only apply them when you absolutely have to and when no movement transformation can apply. As we discussed in the last chapter, do support does not apply only in questions. It also shows up in negative sentences. I ate the apple, I didn't eat the apple. The analysis we gave in the last chapter explains that this fact. Don't select for negative P. The T category in English it selects for negative P is the do form. Appendix tests for determining if a language's main verb to T or not. The following are tests that you can use to determine if a particular language shows main verb to T or not. These tests work well on SVO languages but don't work with SOV languages such as Japanese. If the language shows subject verb often O or other than, it has main verb to T. If the language shows subject often VO or other than, it does not. If the language shows subject verb not O or other than, then it has V to T. If the language shows subject not V or O or other than, it is not. If the main verb subjects undergo T to C movement, then the language has V to T. Ideas, rules, and constraints introduced in this chapter. Transformation, a rule that takes an X-bar generated structure and changes it in restricted ways. Destructure, the level of the derivation created by the base. No transformations have yet applied. S-structure, the output of transformations, the form you perform judgments on. V to T movement, move the head V to the head T motivated by the morphology. Verb movement parameter, all verb raised French or only auxiliaries raised English. The VP internal subject hypothesis, subjects are generated in the specifier of the voice-headed VP. T to C movement, move T to C when there is a phonologically empty complementizer. Do support when there is no other option for supporting inflectional affixes. Insert the dummy verb do into T. That ends the discussion for this episode. So I hope you acquired knowledge for this episode. And for the next episode, I'll be talking about advanced topics in binding theory.